Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the promotion of the study, The End of South Africa, Contemporary South Africa and the Politics of Self-Determination, organized by Belgrade International Law Circle and NSI from South Africa, New South Initiative. Thank you very much for coming today here in person, but also online. I'm really pleased to open this promotion. My name is Miloš Hrnjaz, and I am the president of the governing board of Belgrade International Law Circle and professor of international law at the Faculty of Political Science in Belgrade. Our main goal today is to present the content of this study and to critically assess some of the key points for the application of self-determination in South African context. And in addition, having in mind that we will have a probably separate promotion in South Africa, we wanted today to have some kind of comparative perspective between the application of self-determination in contemporary South Africa, but also in Balkan, Yugoslavia, and Serbia. In a way, the work of Belgrade International Law Circle started with agreement with the New South Initiative to produce the study on this application of self-determination of people. Looking from this perspective today, it was probably a brave decision, having in mind our relatively limited knowledge on South Africa in that moment. However, fortunately, Ivor from New South Initiative was really brave and really kind to offer us to do this study. And we had some previous experience in the field of course, international law and self-determination of people in Yugoslavia. We started from there, and with the significant NSI's help, we used that knowledge to examine the role of application of self-determination in South Africa, both historically and in a contemporary context. And this study is a final result of this teamwork, I would say. It is my great pleasure to have today such a nice and knowledgeable group of friends, people. Ivor Chipkin, Executive Director of NSI, Professor Janja, Simentić, Popović, who is a co-founder of Belgrade International Circle and Professor of International Law. And she's also one of the authors of this study. And of course, Professor Biljana Đorđević from University of Belgrade and Milan Krstić from the same institution. And as you will see, we will have a interdisciplinary approach to this analysis and promotion of the study, since it is mostly based on the international law norms, but also it is important and perhaps crucial in the political context of both Yugoslavia and South Africa. We will start today with Ivor Chipkin. He will introduce us with the political context of South Africa, the work of NSI, and perhaps explain why he believes that this study is important for South Africa and the mission of his organization. Please, your floor is yours.
Miloš, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here in Belgrade and participating in this event. I think you're right. This report is potentially, well, it is unusual to be a piece of work done by a research unit in Belgrade in Serbia on South Africa, especially on a topic, self-determination, which at first appearances doesn't seem to be a term that is part of the South African political discourse, especially not now. So this piece of work and the topic seemed quite remote from the South African debate. And indeed, it might even be regarded as a curiosity. I think absolutely it's not. And I think, as we will see during the panel today, that this work speaks to some of the fundamental questions of contemporary South African politics. But I think more generally, it raises some fundamental questions of politics more generally. And this is really how I want to start. So I think the question of self-determination will come come to it in a moment, raises profoundly the question of the people and the identity of the people. And I think this is precisely the question around which South Africa is struggling currently, around the identity of who South Africans are, who belongs to the political community and who does not belong to the political community. So in my mind, when one's talking about the politics of self-determination, one is talking essentially about a politics that implicates the identity of the political community as a whole. In South Africa today, the current mood is very much pessimistic. The African National Congress is in decline as the ruling party. It looks like in 2024, in the next election, it might even lose its majority, which it's held unambiguously since 1994. Which means it'll govern either in alliance with other parties, or potentially even it'll lose power altogether. In that context, there is a great anxiety in the current situation. So this report rises, therefore, in a context when the conversation in South Africa is overwhelmingly and primarily around party political contestation. My concern, and I think this is where this report is very important, raises the question: what is happening on the edges of politics? In other words, the current arguments or analysis in South Africa takes for granted that all political contestation takes for granted that Parliament and the formal political space is the only game of politics in town, and there are not potentially other games of politics. And I think self-determination is a way of speaking around the other stages of politics on which political contestation is happening. So that's the broader context of why I think this report is important, why this question is fundamental, both in South Africa, but more generally. And this is where I want to make some theoretical comments. So democratic theory and democracies in practice, I think, fundamentally struggle with the question of the limit and essentially with the question of the border. There is no democratic theory for defining the limits of a democracy. All democracies, therefore, are prone to a fundamental instability at the core of the democratic project, precisely because they are unable to generate their own limits. This is an argument that has been made many, many times, most forcibly, I think, in the work of Etienne Balibar. It's at the heart of the work, or more recent work, of Ernesto Leclau and Chantal Mouffe, especially the concept of radical democracy, where they try, in new reflections of the revolution of our time, to develop some concept of a boundary which accords to democratic principles. I think that project fails. The broader point, though, is that theoretically speaking and practically speaking, democracies fail or struggle to determine their own limits. Take, for example, the figure of the democratic figure par excellence, which is that of the citizen. Almost by definition, the citizen is a universal character. It is a citizen, it is a political subject, a bearer of rights and in some cases responsibilities, but without particular marks that are sufficient to distinguish one group of citizens from another group of citizens. And as a result, it raises that profound question of the political boundary. This is why democracies have usually had to refer to a non-democratic principle in order to define themselves as political communities. And in recent times, at least for the last 200 years, that principle has been that of nationalism or nationality. The nationalism or nationalist politics is a dynamics which I think is distinguishable from democratic politics. It's not the same, it's sui generis. And yet democracies, the figure of the citizen, usually articulates to that of nationalism, so that the citizen has ended up over the last 200 years being ultimately a national subject, which is reconciled. Citizens are usually the bearers of rights within nations, but more importantly, the citizen is ultimately also a national subject in order to exercise his rights. And what that means concretely is that the citizen is usually, therefore, becomes a figure who speaks a particular language, has a particular culture, in more contemporary terms, in South African terms, is the bearer of a particular race, has a sexuality. And as a result, these characteristics of population have come to infect the character of citizenship. And now this, I think, is the great price which democracy has paid in relationship to its own conceptual limits. It's had to, if you like, made a Faustin pass, a Faustian pact, a devil's pact with nationalism in order to constitute itself practically as a political community. I think this goes to the heart of the apartheid project, and I think it goes to the heart of the challenges of Yugoslavia in the right through its period, and I think it goes to the heart of the new waves of populism and authoritarian politics in the world. This huge new drive to define the political community not on the basis of the citizen, but simply on the basis of ethnic and racial characteristics. So in asking the question of self-determination in South Africa, I think we are asking a universal question about the way in which democracies are able to constitute themselves as political questions. I think that question is of great urgency, not just for South Africa, but for the world more generally. And I think it raises a profound theoretical question. Is it possible to develop a democracy which is able to generate its own limit? And also a practical question of reconsolidating democratic politics in the world. So South Africa is also a very interesting place to consider this question, precisely because in the course of the anti-apartheid struggle, a form of politics emerges, which I think is extraordinarily liberatory, or we might call invokes a highly emancipatory logic. Right through the anti-apartheid struggle, at least two fundamental dynamics are in competition, sometimes more easily than at other times. Sometimes that competition manifests as an aggression between two different visions. One we might call a straightforward nationalist politics, and in the context of the anti-apartheid struggle, that is a politics that invoked the figure of the African. The bearer of the anti-apartheid struggle was an African, a person of a particular language, of people of particular languages, of a particular race. In relationship to that, though, and this is what I think one of the great and most extraordinary moments of the anti-apartheid struggle, was the development of what we called in South Africa a politics of non-racialism. The term non-racialism has gone in all different directions and might mean something as simple as multiracialism, which I think is valid in some contexts. But non-racialism was also unambiguously, for certain periods of time, non-racialism was also associated with a politics that defied or resisted the politics of nationalism. What it recognized in the famous language of the 1955 Congress of the People was that if all South Africa belonged to all who lived in it. A principle of merely living was invoked as the basis, if you like, of citizenship. The South Africans, and this is what was so revolutionary and radical about the project, about the 1996 Constitution, is that the South African Constitution defines South Africans almost exclusively on principles of who they are not. They are not people of any particular language. There are 9 official languages. They have no particular culture. There's constitutionally multicultural. There's no heterosexual norm. The country recognizes sexual diversity and gender diversity. We are those people that are defined in the absence of traditional national characteristics. Why I think this project is so important, and this is what I think when I don't want to take up your time, what this project shows, what your project shows, is that particular vision of South Africa, which is what we're living as well, is fundamentally in crisis. And it is in crisis because nationalist politics is contesting the very viability of such a political community and invoking the idea that South Africa needs to be and must be a political community defined on traditional bases of nation, of language, of race, of culture, of gender. I find it quite disturbing. I think this report is a major report, potentially a very, very important one. I'm very, very pleased to be here to discuss it and to launch it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivor, indeed. We will proceed now. You were also very accurate. So we will proceed now with my colleague and friend Janja. I already introduced her, and she's one of the authors of the study. She was especially engaged with application or legitimizing political goals of various political actors during the different phases of South African history and the application of self-determination of people in this regard. Janja, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miloš. Thank you, Ivor, for this wonderful introduction and also for supporting our project. My goal today will be to present you one part of the study. Namely, I will try to draw some of our major conclusions, which are both applicable both to South African context, but also I will try to explain how they are important in some wider context as well. I believe that is something that Ivor also mentioned, how some of these questions are actually fundamental question of politics, but also I will add fundamental question of law. So what I would like to maybe define first is actually the norm of self-determination that we actually wanted to see how it developed and how it was or was not applied in the context of South Africa throughout the history of South Africa. And in that regard, I would like to mention that we actually have two aspects of self-determination, namely the external one and the internal one. And actually, these two aspects give us two definitions or two conceptualizations of self-determination. So the first one, I would start with the external self-determination norm, which actually implies the rights of people to succeed from an existing state and establish a sovereign and independent state, or freely associate or integrate with another independent state. And this was actually the norm of self-determination that was used in the process of decolonization. And this is actually the norm that, if I may lean to what Ivor mentioned, in terms of inclusion and exclusions, the principles of inclusion and exclusion actually norm that led to exclusion, namely to formation of newly independent states. On the other hand, we had also the formation, the establishment of the norm in terms of its internal aspect, which actually meant, and it is actually based on a democratic principle of participation, and actually can be regarded as a people's right to live in a state in which all groups of people are equally represented in the general government and can choose their own political status and govern their own political will. So here we actually see how the principle of self-determination in its internal aspect can actually be and should be inclusive in order to include all the people living in one particular state. So we wanted to see how these two aspects of self-determination were actually applied throughout the history of South Africa. And here I would, even though in the study we covered a wider period, here I would mention the apartheid era and the anti-apartheid struggle, as well as the immediate period after the apartheid and the formation establishment of the Constitution of South Africa. So during the anti-apartheid struggle, the international community, epitomized especially in the United Nations, actually used very much the language of self-determination in the context of South Africa, even though it was not only in terms of decolonization, but also in terms of human rights protection. So this is the setting that we actually entered in. But when we wanted to see whether that language, whether these claims of self-determination were used by the internal actors in South Africa, we actually saw that the primary actors actually did not lean on these self-determination claims in neither of the two forms that I just mentioned. So what we actually found is that the African National Congress, ANC, the major driving force in the struggle against the apartheid, actually did not use such claim, especially after 1955 and the Freedom Charter. Then we also wanted to see, since the ANC was actually representing the government in some international fora, we wanted to see maybe whether in these international fora, ANC maybe relied on the self-determination claims. And we then looked its relation with the United Nations, as well as its participation in a diplomatic conference on international humanitarian law. And there as well, we could not find any open reliance on the self-determination principle or a norm. So we wanted to see why is that so. And on the one hand, we actually mentioned in the study that maybe the concept of non-racial politics, which was actually pursued by the ANC, which Ivor just mentioned, was not actually susceptible to applying the self-determination norm. But we also saw another thing which we delved into deeper in the study is actually that the other side, or the opponent or the proponent of the apartheid, actually, which was the government of South Africa at that time, and the National Party, actually used the language of self-determination. And then we came to conclusion that it might be that the fact that the self-determination claims were used by the proponents of apartheid in the South Africa actually in a way contaminated the principle and the norm, and that is why it was not used by the in the apartheid struggle in South Africa. So this is the conclusion regarding this period for South Africa. But the wider conclusion that I would like to draw, which can be applicable in some other contexts, and I believe that they will be mentioned here by my colleagues, is actually that what we see is that the political struggle, when a legal norm such as self-determination is used in a political form, in the political struggle, it can actually be not just used, but also misused. And when it is misused, it can actually lead to consequences which are not necessarily in the realm of normative, but in the realm of political. So what we see is, again, that it is very much important to understand the context in which we use a norm and the political context in which we are analyzing. So the other political context which we also wanted to analyze is what happened after apartheid. So when the apartheid was over and when the talks began for the establishment of the constitution of New South Africa, of new constitution, we actually saw the emergence of the self-determination principle, actually the self-determination norm. And today, actually, the section 235 of the South African Constitution actually has something that is called the right to self-determination. So we can find the norm in the Constitution itself. And the norm I would shortly cited is actually that the right of South African people as a whole to self-determination, as manifested in its constitution, does not preclude, within the framework of this right, recognition of the notion of the right to self-determination of any community sharing a common cultural and language heritage within a territorial unity in the Republic or in any other way determined by national legislation. So when we looked at this provision, which is provision now of South African national law, actually, and when we look at how it came to be in the how it found its place in the Constitution, we actually saw that if we come back to the external and the internal aspects of the self-determination, here we actually see that the norm tried to actually encapsulate the internal aspect of the self-determination. However, some of the authors actually explain us that the norm might even in the future trigger the external claims for the external self-determination. This is something that we actually saw in the process of constitution, during the constitution establishing, when we saw that some of the right-wing parties, such as Freedom Front and the IFP, actually in their negotiations with the government, actually used the legal claim of external self-determination in order to achieve some of the concessions, political concessions regarding their interests. So the other conclusions that we draw, and this is where I would also conclude, is actually that this line between the external and internal aspect of self-determination actually is a delicate one. And when a group actually feels, any group, particular group in a state actually feels that its internal aspect of self-determination is not satisfied, might actually turn to base its claim on its external aspect. So whenever, and I believe that is something that Ivor referred to previously, whenever a society is in a state of any transition, we might actually see this delicate line, which can be actually turned into practice. Here in the South Africa today, of course, this is not still the case, but it is important to understand at the end how when we look at South Africa and self-determination, even though their links are not visible on the surface, actually, when we delve deeper, we can definitely see them. And this is something that we need to bear in mind also for future, not just legal, but also political happenings and establishment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janja. Now we will proceed with my colleague Biljana Đorđević, and one of the reasons she's, as I said, she is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Political Science, but she teaches political theory. And one of the reasons why she's with us today is also because her PhD dissertation was the problem of constitution of the body politic in democratic theories. And in that dissertation, she was involved in the problem of constitution of demos by democratic means. And one aspect of our study, of course, it is a short, really short aspect, but one of the aspects of the study was that identification of the notion of a people. Of course, we have just a couple of pages here, but my general conclusion is that we international lawyers have a huge problem with the addressee of that right of self-determination, because we, in a way, imported that notion from the political theory, and it is a contested one in political theory too. So that is one of the reasons why we also have that problem, in my opinion, in international law. Biljana, thank you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miloš. So I'll start with that. Actually, it's very interesting that when we are, in some particular discipline, and then we study some concepts, or I don't know, do different type of research, and end up with something that we feel we can just rely and say, okay, this is what is done somewhere else. Like, I don't know, multiculturalism focuses on culture, and then it's not really defined what culture is, and then you take it as a black box and a very homogeneous thing, and then anthropology says this is really not the case. So I guess that is just one more confirmation why we actually have to try to cross these disciplinary boundaries. In my particular case, I was actually when I started working on my dissertation, I had this question about and a desire to see if there is something in democratic theory that can give you an answer to the question how we can delimit boundaries of people by democratic means. And Ivor already said that it's almost impossible to find an answer to such a question. But it did not stop me from thinking about this, how you can do it to be more in line with democratic principles. So if you can't really do it, then maybe you can think and look at different theories. What would people that is more in line with democracy be, instead of just saying this can't be done, and it hasn't been done. That usually the boundaries of people have not been formed in the past in democratic times, at least what we define as democratic times. Now, this is also, I mean, for political theory, it's always a problem, because we also look at different, when we talk about different concepts, it's also histories of ideas. So there is one history for concept of people that you can trace from Roman language and populus, but it's not the same as demos in Athenian political philosophy. So it's different meaning. But we now, as contemporary scholars, we actually rely on all of these histories, and they somehow are interlinked with what we now think as democracy. So my initial idea that you can maybe find some philosophical principle in the process of thinking and working on this, and also I have to mention this because this is a part of the story of also political practice, led me to realize that maybe I dislike the answer, but at least as an initial answer, I have to agree with some authors who said that boundaries are defined by history and politics, not by principles, not by philosophical principles. And maybe this explains why, as you say in your study, basically no international treaty defined the term people, because once you defined it, then it's something there to be applied elsewhere. And it's questionable whether even when first it was used, it was, I mean, even an idea of a universal concept, but it, probably was ethnocentric concept, having my particular people, particular problems, particular ideas behind it. So it's always safe to just leave it undefined, and then to basically make it contestable issue, not just among legal scholars, but precisely political ones and politics, and basically what will then be defined as people will be the issue of who will be recognized as people, but in relevant arenas. And of course, this will always be dissatisfying for many. and there will always be reasons for contesting such a result. And in a way, my general answer is that if we cannot have a democratic way of constituting people, on one hand, because in previous history, many peoples have been constituted in undemocratic times, colonization, arbitrary boundary drawing, wars and international treaties. It's never a perfect congruence between territory where some ethnicity lives or some groups that share some of these elements, either religion, language, culture, whatever culture means. So it's almost never like that. So that was in the past. So you can say, of course, okay, then it's not a problem because it was in the past, it was settled. Now we treat some group as people, and now we will go in the process democratization. So in a way, it's an easy answer. But the problem is what to do now, and you have now claims, and that was in particular the issue of Yugoslavia, with the breakup of Yugoslavia. So in a sense, to me, it was dissatisfying to just say history should have solved that. So because what if it hadn't solved, and what are we to do now? Should we just say, okay, let's allow nationalism as external principle just to settle this issue? And nationalism is also a political concept. It's also a different concept we have different concept of nations. And in that sense, even that as some general principle is not satisfying to all different cases. So in a way, my take is that you have to try to find some principles that are more close to democracy than others. And one that to me is convincing on a philosophical level and then applied in particular cases is all subjected principles. So that all of these people who are subjected to some structures, usually already undemocratic structures, all these people who are subjected to these structures, they're participating in willingly or unwillingly, just by the fact that they're born in some territory. They have the right to be citizens. They have the right to contest in these undemocratic structures and make them more democratic. And by this fact, they have to do it actively, and then they become people. Now, you can't, as a principle, you can't then say who is a citizen, who is not. It's because I think it gives you a space that you can contest also the boundaries of who belongs to people. That maybe some person at this moment is an immigrant and it does not have special ties with particular territory, but in a couple of years it creates these special ties, and then it probably it can also be even more part of these people than somebody who has all the relevant criteria of speaking the language or sharing the common religion, but maybe living away for many years. So in a sense, that is in line, I think, with the overall idea that democratization is somehow always more connected with space and territory. Territory is very problematic, and we cannot have good answer to this, how we can delimit some territory and say this is ours, because if we want to try to do that, if we want to organize a referendum on independence, it's always a question who has the right to vote, and that's already a boundary question. We already have to know who has the right to make this decision, and this decision will never be fully democratic. It will always exclude someone. But there is, I think, a way to think about this that this foundation would always be somehow legitimate, but you can make some steps, you can have some principles in the Constitution how to make it more inclusive in further moments. But the idea that you base the concept of people just on some subjective feelings, and that there is no, this criteria of proximity, people living next to each other, to me, this is undemocratic, because to have an active performance as citizen, I think you need to actually share some space with others and organize and basically occupy some space. Of course, you can vote, you can do a lot of things online. We can live in transnational lives, care about what is happening in our home countries if we are, I don't know, immigrants. But real politics is happening in the field, in some space. And it is also uncomfortable, as democracy is uncomfortable, that we maybe with people that we don't see as I don't know, of the same ethnic kin, actually have to try to make conversations, try to make consensus to push forward some policies, and that is this element of people. Now, I don't know if I can maybe stop at this.
Just a minute or so.
Yeah, I can maybe stop at this stage because in general, I could talk for days about this. Maybe final thing is that it's a different purpose for I don't know, the conception of people as something that would serve for self-determination in international arena. But I guess it plays with this internal and external. I think with many, if we treat self-determination here as a human right that you also mentioned in your publication, basically, I think for all of human rights, we can have this external and internal dilemma, internal application, especially having in mind what reaction we expect from international community. So I think in a way, people here can be, collective actor who requires demands some recognition, but it can also be a call for unification, for activity, participation, and also for delineation against those who abuse the concept of people and proclaim that they're the only ones who represent, like, populists. So in a way, I think this is very unsettling. I think if you want clear answers, to just apply something, but it's also productive because we should find that we all use this concept, not just to give it to somebody else, like to populists who claim that they are the only ones who can represent. So I think that in this struggle over who occupies this collective subject, this is what politics is about, and will never change. That's why we can't really actually put this on a paper and fix it forever.
Thanks. This reminded me on one definition of the definitions that says that every definition is a violence. So probably every definition of the concept of people is a violence in a way. But of course, the problem in international law, you usually want and expect clear-cut answers. So that is one of the reasons why I believe that international lawyers are struggling with these kind of concepts. Now it is a very strange thing to introduce myself. I already told you that I'm teaching public international law and some other sub-branches of international law at the Faculty of Political Science, but I'm also really interested. One of the research fields of mine is self-determination of people, especially in the context of Yugoslavia. So I would like to stress in these following 10 minutes, I would like to stress 2 or maybe 3 things that I find crucial in a comparative perspective or application of self-determination of people in the context of Yugoslavia and South Africa. The first one is the main difference between Yugoslavia and South Africa and the application of this principle. The second one is probably similarity between the cases. And the third one is me trying to be a prophecy in this regard and to see whether South Africa could avoid the destiny of Yugoslavia, and I think it can. So I will start with that main difference between the 2 cases. The establishment of Yugoslavia in 1918 was inter alia based on the principle of self-determination. During the Versailles negotiations, the Yugoslav delegation there, led by Nikola Pašić and Ante Trumbić, actually recalled the then principle. In that moment, that was not the right on self-determination, but it was a principle of international relations, not international law. But they sensed the zeitgeist of that moment, and they tried, especially Ante Trumbić, because of the situation in Croatia and some disputes that Yugoslavia or that future country had with Italia. And he insisted on the application of self-determination, not so much by Nikola Pašić, but anyway, they tried to use that to legitimize their political goals by using the principle of self-determination with limited success. Of course, on the other hand, there was a problem with using that kind of principle in South African context at the, let's say, beginning of the 20th century. Namely, there was some kind of South African delegation on these negotiations, and there were people in South Africa in that moment. They of course heard the 14 points of Wilson's, and they hoped that that principle of self-determination will be applied in a South African context too. But unfortunately, as we all know, Wilson soon changed his mind about the application of self-determination of people on all meridians, or on all points in the world. And it was exclusive in a way, first of all, in Europe, but not only in Europe, but for the countries that won the war. So at the beginning, that was the beginning of self-determination of peoples in international law. And at the beginning, you can see that a limited application and that story about exclusion and inclusion of various people and application of self-determination. So unfortunately, that was not the point in that moment, and unfortunately, this self-determination people could not be extended to colonized people, but only to Europeans and only to some Europeans. On the other hand, the similarity between the cases of South Africa and Yugoslavia is that later on, during the various phases of the Yugoslavia and South Africa, various political leaders, as Janja already said something about that, used the principle of self-determination in order to legitimize their political goals. And of course, that was the case in Yugoslavia too. Yugoslavia, especially during the Second World War, the Communist Party, and after the Second World War, the Communist Party was closely related to the, let's say, Soviet doctrine of self-determination and the vision of the Lenin, and after that, the Stalin, about the application of self-determination. So it was really important part of the establishment of the, let's say, second Yugoslavia. But not only that, self-determination of peoples was really crucial, let's say, important for the foreign policy goals of that second Yugoslavia and the story about non-alignment. And it seems really that Yugoslavia was, you can find the books from the mid-60s, for example, and some other periods of time about the application of self-determination and the invitation to apply that in the process of decolonization. And you will see that Yugoslavia really honestly and concretely supported that process of self-determination in the international context. So it was really important both for internal aspect in Yugoslavia, but also in a foreign policy of the country. And unfortunately, as we all know, the circle was rounded by the bloody wars or armed conflicts in Yugoslavia, and in the essence, or in the middle of that conflict about the future visions of Yugoslavia or future countries established by the dissolution of Yugoslavia, was the question about the application of self-determination, of course, between Slovenia and Serbia before anyone else, but also some other republics, and who is the addressee of that right of the self-determination of the people was part of that conflict that unfortunately took too many lives. But in a way, I'm closing out with that third segment. The question is whether South Africa could avoid that kind of destiny. And I really believe that it can, firstly, because there is a significant difference between the historical roots and the historical role of self-determination of people in Yugoslavian and South African context, as I already said. However, we can see some tendencies right now in South Africa in this regard. And in some cases, you have some kind of, let's say, perfect storm with inequality of the citizens, with the economic crisis, with the politics of identity. And we can see that, it seems to me that we can see that now in contemporary South Africa. And I'm a little bit afraid in that sense that you can have some kind of perfect storm in that kind of situation. As we already heard, some political actors can use that situation or misuse that situation in order to legitimize sometimes even radical political goals. So it is the task of the society to find ways to deal with these kind of questions, because if it doesn't do that, then it is that situation is a futile ground for a movement that could jeopardize the future of that country. I will finish with that right now. Thank you, Miloš. And now it is my real pleasure to introduce my former student, but now my colleague and friend, assistant professor Milan Krstić. Milan is teaching foreign policy, but also studies of Balkan. And he's involved in that MA program at our faculty, and he teaches several subjects there. He's really interested, and he has papers on the topic of the relations between Serbia and these ex-Yugoslavian countries and neighbors of Serbia. So we will use this opportunity and his knowledge to hear some of his thoughts on the issue of the application of self-determination in contemporary context in this post-Yugoslavian space, if we can call it that way. Thank you, Milan.
Thank you very much, Miloš. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, esteemed guests, first of all, I would like to state that I'm not comparativist, I'm not a political scientist from the comparative perspective, neither political theorist, so my field of research is neither, and I'm also not an international lawyer, but I'm an IR researcher, so international relations researcher, and basically my PhD dealt with the one topic which is, well, which belongs to the political sociology generally, and that is stigma. And also it's followed by one interesting concept of taboo. Why am I mentioning that? Because I think that when we make some sort of comparison between the current context in the South Africa and also in the Balkans, there is a tabooization. So the self-determination is sort of a taboo in those societies in which minorities might try to misuse it from the perspective of majority. And I will just try to go through the current situation in the most important neuralgic points of the Western Balkans, mostly Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Northern Macedonia as well, and try to explain the logic and how that happened, that the self-determination as a concept became to a certain extent a taboo for one group, and at the same time some sort of a political tool which might be used in order to either get the right to make a self-determination, external or internal, or as Janja said, to make some sort of concessions in political negotiation and bargaining in the internal scene. So basically, to start with Kosovo, and it's logical to start with Kosovo because the current ruling party and the most influential party in Kosovo is called Self-Determination. This movement basically exists for already 15 years, even more than 15 years, and its political identity is based on the request for self-determination of Albanian nation in Kosovo. So basically, it is a form of Albanian nationalism, which is to a certain extent packed in the principle of self-determination, and which was firstly in 2005-2006 when it was founded, arguing, advocating strongly for the independence of Kosovo. But then afterwards, nowadays in the current political context, the self-determination also is a hot word frequently used by those advocating either for the unification of Albania and Kosovo, or for those who are advocating for the extension of Kosovo to incorporate the so-called Preševo Valley, so the South Serbia. And it is interesting that at the same time, those groups who are in favor, who frequently use the word self-determination, they are strongly against any kind of concessions to Serbs regarding the possible autonomy in Kosovo's political system, which is, I think, basically the consequence of the fact that they are aware that they could spoil their own argument if they give the chance to Serbs to use it as well. In that sense, I would just like to go briefly to the past. I don't want to go to the genesis of the Albanian self-determination movement in Kosovo, which has the left-wing roots and also some right-wing roots, and then it merged. But just to go briefly to 2005 and 2006, when the self-determination movement was proclaiming that the General Assembly of United Nations Resolution 1514 is giving the opportunity, the right actually, not the opportunity, to people to make a secession and to have the so-called external self-determination. From that period until nowadays, self-determination movement is insisting on that right, but strictly to Albanian people, basically in Kosovo. On the other hand, Serbs do not use this term at all. It is an interesting finding from my point of view, and I think that the reason for that is basically a taboo. Janja has mentioned that in this study, one of the findings is actually that in South Africa, and Ivor has mentioned that as well, that in South Africa it's quite rare to find in political discourse the use of self-determination, except in those cases which were mentioned as a sort of frequently used word. It is similar with Serbs in Kosovo. Serbs in Kosovo do not use this term. Of course, there is a necessity to make one clarification. Serbs in Kosovo do not use it because Serbs consider Kosovo to be part of Serbia. And if you use it, that could be a double-edged sword, because it means that you're already recognizing that Kosovo had the right on self-determination, and to proclaim a secession, you don't consider it to be a separate country, independent country, so you're not claiming the same right for yourself. But on the other hand, it might be a politically wise in some aspects, at least to threat, at least to say, okay, if we recognize your right, that you had a right on self-determination, then we would require the same for ourselves. But Serbs never do that. Even when some Serbs are arguing in favor of partition, for example, or delineation in Kosovo, as it was argued at least 4 or 5 years ago, especially by the current and then ruling political leaders in Serbia, Vučić and Dačić, they never used the concept of self-determination. So they insisted on either realistic choice or the necessity to make a historical agreement, to know what is ours, and so on and so forth, but never self-determination as a principle, which I think that is basically the consequence of this taboo which exists. And if you use the self-determination, that means that you're giving the credits to the self-determination movement of Albanians, to not only Kurti, but all of those who consider that Albanians in Kosovo have and had and still have the right on self-determination, had the right to make a secession from Serbia, and have the right in future maybe to unite with Albania. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the situation is completely different. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbs are actually using the concept of self-determination not as a principle, but as a right, as Dodik says, quite frequently. But that is exclusively reserved for Milorad Dodik and the current leadership of Republika Srpska. The opposition does not use the concept so frequently. Basically, Dodik uses opportunities to insist that there is a right of people to secede as a norm of international law. So the external dimension of self-determination is something on which Dodik insists that is actually a part of an international law norm. And it is interesting that usually his claim is countered by an argument that this is not a right guaranteed by the Bosnian constitution. So the counter arguments usually goes direct towards the Dayton Peace Accord and not to the fact that it might be controversial if this norm exists on the international level, in the sense that it could be applied to Serbs in Bosnia. So usually those who are trying to counter Dodik's claims, they do not go into the debate about, generally speaking, does the international law guarantee you a right to make a secession and to apply that on Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina from the point of view of international law, regardless of the Dayton Peace Accord. Of course, Dayton Peace Accord is part of international law as well, but they're not discussing the principle as such. They only go towards the fact that there is a treaty, that there is an agreement, and that agreement has also formulated a Bosnian constitution. So basically, that is the counter argument. They're not going into deep discussion about what is the self-determination right and how it should be pursued in the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Of course, there is another group in Bosnia and Herzegovina which demands self-determination, but more an internal self-determination, and that is that those are Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And basically, the demands for secession from Bosnia are still not part of like the political mainstream among Croats, but the demands for a third entity are already part of the political mainstream among Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that is one aspect of, let's say, upgrade of the current political power sharing agreement in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which would, from a Croatian position, give additional element of internal self-determination for Croats. In Northern Macedonia, these requests are at the backstage, so they're not in the front stage of the political game. And in Montenegro, basically, sometimes you can hear that, especially those political options which are claiming that they protect the statehood of Montenegro, that they also refer to the 2006 and the will of people at the plebiscite, at the referendum for the Montenegro's independence, so that they are also defending the self-determination from 2006, but usually they do not refer to that principle. They usually refer to the principle of statehood. So it's because the self-determination might mean that citizens of Montenegro could also change their opinion and vote again to become part of of some sort of state union with Serbia. So those who are more on national Montenegrin positions, they usually claim that they're defending the statehood, not the self-determination. So it's not quite frequently used word in Montenegrin political context as well. Basically, to conclude, I think that there is a lot of merit for our context also from this study, and I would like to congratulate to the authors of this study once again. And when I was reading it, I was trying to make some sort of parallels, what might be interesting maybe in your future work to focus on policy-wise especially. So there are a lot of important questions regarding the self-determination as a principle. One of them is policy-wise, how to reconcile the ethnic identity with the state identity, especially in the context of, for example, South Africa, but also here in the Balkans, the Montenegro, despite the fact that it's completely different in terms of size and historical genesis and so on and so forth, but it has the similar problem. So you have like the ethnic identity and state identity, how to reconcile those two in Bosnia and Herzegovina as well, but it is a different example, but still, so how to try to make state functions, how to try to make, for example, Serbs in Montenegro be happy with the Montenegrin state identity, not challenging it, and at the same time being safe about their Serbian identity and not feeling the fear that the Montenegrin state might deprive them from the Serb identity. So how to reconcile these ethnic and state identity principles. Also, are demands for external self-determination always negative for a state? That is one open question policy-wise. Some states have accepted, like United Kingdom, the referendum, the plebiscite of Scotland, as a legitimate tool. Also in our case, we had the State Union of Serbia and Montenegro dissolution basically in 2006 as a consequence of the plebiscite, but we also had a lot of negative examples in 1990s of how the self-determination brought basically not the self-determination as a principle, but its practical implementation brought to the but let's say the violent dissolution of Yugoslavia. Also in foreign policy wise, there is one relevant question: how far shall a state go in the support of self-determination principle in its foreign policy? Because it's also a double-edged sword. I don't have too much time to elaborate on that any further, but I will just stop here. And the final one, which I think that the Western Balkan case gives a lot of examples and a lot of food for thoughts, is the question how to prevent requests for external self-determination and keep them inside demands for internal self-determination. So basically how to try to make some sort of how to keep the stability and to prevent the secessionist requests, but to make a discussion about how to include through the forms of internal self-determination those people which are basically frustrated because of their position in a certain state. Of course, the most logical answer would be try to co-opt them, try to make them feeling happy because they live in that particular state. But we all do know that that is not so easy. And I think that the Balkan actually offers at least two answers on in which cases you have less requests for external self-determination. The first is that when there is no territorial autonomy, so the non-existence of territorial autonomy reduces chances for external self-determination requests. Basically, in Northern Macedonia, Albanians do not have such strong requests for self-determination. For example, there is no territorial autonomy. There is a different power sharing mechanism which does not guarantee some form of territorial entity consisted of Albanian majority, or Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina as well, although they are majority in some of the cantons. Serbs in Kosovo also, despite the fact that some are advocating for the partition of Kosovo, or Albanians and Bosniaks in Montenegro or in Serbia, they do not have any kind of formal territorial autonomy. Their autonomy is more on personal and other levels. And the second is that the incoherent territorial dispersion of a group reduces the chances for a secessionist claims. I think that is one of the findings of your study as well. So as you claim at the page 42, the idea of the Volksstaat largely fell away due, among other things, to the lack of territorial concentration of the people who might have been mobilized for self-determination. So basically, one of the most important arguments against partition might be that you are losing an opportunity to get a good power sharing agreement, which would make benefits for your group in the whole territory if you decide to go to a minimalist approach and to make a secession of one part of a territory in which you are a majority. That is the case, for example, that might be the case with Serbs in Kosovo currently, because Serbs in Kosovo, if a partition is pursued, then the south of Ibar River, majority of Serbs who live in Kosovo will actually probably be left without any kind of institutional protection, without even the existing mechanisms of consociation according to Ahtisaari plan and so on and so forth. Also in case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, what would be with Brčko district, which actually connects Republika Srpska, two parts of Republika Srpska. Owen Stoltenberg peace plan from 1994 was based on that pre-assumption. So basically, you should give everyone a formal right to make a secession. But if they decide to do that, they will lose a part of territory. For example, Sarajevo as a district will become part of the Bosniak entity. Brčko will become part of the Bosniak entity. Otherwise, it will be part of Republika Srpska. Croats will lose the access to sea from Neum if they decide to make a secession from Bosnia, and so on and so forth. So basically, I think that these two findings might be interesting in your future research as a comparative example, and that they're actually quite useful to compare with the South African case as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Milan. Well, having in mind the time, I will not make any final conclusions on this. It would be maybe premature, but I just want to thank you all for participation, and to see whether we have the opportunity to maybe have some questions from the audience from the Zoom. So if anyone have some comments or questions, please.
There aren't any questions from the floor at the moment.
If there is no question in this moment, yes, of course.
I just want to note something quite special about this moment, potentially even remarkable, especially for someone coming from South Africa. We are in Belgrade talking about South Africa in comparative perspective. That I think already is original, and I think worth noting. The second thing is we're having a conversation about South Africa in relationship to the history of the Balkans, and more broadly speaking to the history of Eastern Europe. I think that again is something conceptually and politically challenging, and I think very important. South Africa has just gone through a period of what we call state capture. As you all know, the term state capture is developed in relationship to thinking about the transition from socialism in the Soviet Union. What the term does is very unexpectedly, it situates South Africa in comparison into an unusual reference, and those to Eastern Europe into the socialist transition. So I think this idea of South Africa's reference and its point of that there is a worthy dialogue between the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and South Africa, and the African context, I think is a highly original idea, but I think it's also incredibly conceptually fertile idea. So I just wanted to say that in a very interesting presentation for a New South Institute launch, Radmila Nakarada, who's very happily here, used an expression which I think is apposite for this conversation. And she talked about Yugoslavia as being a country where there were insufficient Yugoslavs. And I wonder if that's a similar situation for South Africa today, that with the language of self-determination may not be strongly present, but clearly we are undergoing very profound challenges around the identity of who South Africans are. And I think that question might apply in South Africa. Is South Africa a place where there are sufficient South Africans? And I'm increasingly worrying that it is not. So I think it's an incredibly fertile conversation. I would love to be able to engage further with all of you, because I think so mmany profound things have been said. I'd love to take up this idea of a subjective definition of the political community rather than an objective one, because I think it raises all sorts of exciting possibilities, but also frightening ones, especially this idea that we find a principle which might not be a democratic principle, but is closer to democracy as the basis of the boundary. I find that idea quite fascinating, and I would even propose that the concept of non-racialism might do that for you. Those are my questions and challenges to the rest of you.
Thank you. Well, if there are no questions in this moment or comments, once again, thank you all. We will have this record of this meeting also on YouTube. So, and we will share the link for everyone who didn't have the opportunity to be today with us. And hopefully we will see you again on the similar opportunity in South Africa. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Recording stopped.